All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started with some just housekeeping. This is being recorded. We will share the recording with everyone who is registered for today's conversation, and they will be on our website and our YouTube channel, so you can always find them there. We do want this to be interactive, so we really encourage you to use the Q&A to ask questions, and we will try to get as many of your questions answered by Drew today. So please go ahead and take advantage of that. And so I would like to begin by acknowledging the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians people, traditional custodians of the land on which the Gardner Institute resides, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and we extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples here today. So lessons learned. This is the first one for 2025. We are super excited to have you all here. And Lesson Learned showcases newly published works from higher education experts. It's an open forum accessible to all who are interested in discussing post-secondary education. For the first in this series in 2025, we're starting with our own author and CEO of the Gardner Institute, Drew Koch. Welcome, Drew. Drew is usually joining me in asking questions, so today we're turning the tables on him a little bit. And Drew's book, Transforming the Gateway Course Experience, A Call for Action for Fire Education. We're fired up, but it is higher education. This is Drew's third book and his first as a solo author. So congratulations, Drew. I have a few questions for Drew, and then I'll be opening it up to the participants to engage in a question and answer session. Drew, I'm not going to list your rather significant bio, but instead I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and let our audience know what brought you to this place writing this book today.
Katie, thanks. And thanks for having me here today. Part of my bio is usually I co-host Lessons Learned with Katie Luck, but as you mentioned, it's an opportunity to turn the mic, if you will, and the camera towards me, given that this book came out. I will really focus in on the why this book, why'd you do it sort of piece. And I will say that for a long while, I resisted even the idea of writing the book, right? There were, just as I write a bit about elements with imposter syndrome in the book itself, I'm like, who am I to write this? And why should I write it? Things along those lines. I mean, I could always find a reason, like it's been a while since I taught, and I taught a lot in high school, and all these elements. But it became abundantly clear, actually, through some work with the American Historical Association, that because of the privileges and opportunities that came with my role, I was beginning to amass a fair amount of knowledge and, in some cases, a lot of data on issues surrounding, what we define as gateway courses in the book. And as David Brightman, who initially was the editor on this book, and then became the in-house editor and critical friend in chief, said, Drew, if not you, who? So I think it came, and John and Betsy, definitely, John Gardner and Betsy Barefoot, the Institute's co-founders, definitely encouraged writing this book. But I think it came as we were working with first 13 and then 20 and then 30 and, upwards of 60, 70 institutions on course redesign. Patterns emerged in data, patterns emerged in challenges, patterns emerged in opportunities to really define the issue, place a spotlight on it in ways that we were uniquely qualified to do. And so I ran with that. I will tell you, running it was more like a slow jog or maybe even a slow walk. As I mentioned in the forward to the book, that I started this in really 2019, and knocked out a few drafts of chapters, and I was raring to go. And then the pandemic happened, and I really questioned the value of a book on, what were traditionally perceived as, face-to-face blended or hybrid courses. But again, this got back to John, Betsy, and David respectively saying these courses were an issue before the pandemic, they're an issue during the pandemic, they're going to be an issue when the pandemic is endemic. Write the damn book. So, in part because of where I was, what I was doing, who I got to work with, and also in part because, not unlike with my own students, and not unlike in my own journey as a student, in this case, there were a number of folks who saw in me what I questioned whether I had in me, and hence the book that we have now, right? So I'm really grateful. The forward itself, I probably have close to 100 people or organizations listed in that, and they all combined to help me write this thing in ways that some of them are like, oh yeah, I did do that. Like they don't remember it, but I do. So Katie, thanks for asking. I think the main reason for all of this, Drew aside, is because this is a huge issue in higher ed. And it's a issue that often gets attributed to student readiness. And there's a really strong element sometimes of, blaming the students, blaming the victim, if you will, when in essence, there's a lot of reproduction of maybe bad practice. The good news is we've come a long way, right, over the past several decades on this, but we still have a long way to go. So this was a effort to bring greater awareness to, name, maybe in a few cases shame, not by name, but at least say we can do better than this in higher ed. And that really compelled me to write it as well. That's the thing that kept me going, right? Betsy Barefoot was not calling me at 3 in the morning when I'd wake up and sit down and do some things with this book, right? It was really that there is a broader issue, and there was a broader constituency out there that needed to know it wasn't just them. They were not alone, and they needed some help in defining terms and having a book that's a call to action. So anyway, a whole lot of reasons, but those are the reasons why I wrote it. And I'm glad I had encouragement and support from folks here to do it.
Excellent, thank you. So Drew, during a normal interview, people might start with the beginning of the book and go through the book,
That
but
would be
you know
boring
me,
and predictable. Yes. Yeah.
you know me well enough to know I'm never going to do things the normal way. And I want to start with the chapter that really caught my interest, which was chapter 4, Weeding Out the Weed Out Culture. And I know that the chapter was written in partially in response to an article. Some students are smarter than others, and that's okay. I think I moved my child from a school once. The principal told me that. It was published in that article was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education in August 2020. And I'm sure, probably most of our audience has had the experience or heard of the experience of the infamous sort of look to your left, look to your right. One of you will, only one of you will graduate from this, whatever institution it is. So can you give us a brief overview of how grades as we know them came to be and how our higher education, boy, there we go again, higher education became, as described by D.L. Stewart, to exist for only certain privileged people, and how gateway courses based on this weed out culture perpetuate this systemic inequity?
So yes to all three questions. I'm glad to
I'm trying to get them all in there at once.
all in there before I start. And Liz, so um, I go through the history of grading as I was able to understand it from my research in the chapter, and I'm not going to like reiterate that line by line because um, you'd all be asleep in about 3 minutes, and I don't only have just begun. What I will say is that in digging into it, I was surprised to learn that grades are really a latter 19th century construct. Um, and that maybe a decade or so, not even 2, 3 decades after Harvard adopted the approach based on what I believe Mount Holyoke had been doing. Um, there were already laments about grade inflation. And I chuckle about that because, I read a lot in, say, the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed about people saying, oh, the grades are inflated in comparison to where they were in, the 1990s or the 1980s. And I'm like, well, if you go back in the 1890s and 1880s, they were lamenting about that. And they had only been grading for about 6 to 12 years. So to me, that sort of history of grading piece is is not so much like where did it come from and why do they have them, although it was initially an A through E scale, and then students went home and said E stands for excellent when it means you failed the course, so they changed it to an F, right? And anyway, but a lot of that is really if we're associating grading with quality or performance, in that we believe that somehow students were brighter, better, back in the golden era. The reality situation is that doesn't seem to be supported by the body of evidence that's out there, right? And um, so that then does get us to um, grades as an indicator of success. And I understand they exist and they function as that. And they're the best worst or the worst best form of of a measure for those courses. That's shared. Um, there's something also fascinating with the grades, and I mentioned this in the chapter, is that there's a relative norming by institution type, right? And that is, uh, these rates of D grades, F grades, W's for withdrawals, I's for incompletes, or the equivalent of that of the peer on the campus or at an institution. There are ranges that hold true across institutions. And one researcher said that was true in some of the most highly selective institutions as it was in open access institutions. So if that's the case, and students in the most highly selective institutions were selected because they're awesome, then why is it that they have the same rates potentially or on average as students in open access institutions? And that to me is a social construct, and it's not necessarily indicative of actual student capacity. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say give everyone an A, right? And I'm even necessarily coming on one level or another level of grading or ungrading or things along those lines. What I'm basically saying is there's a history to grading that also gets at the history of a weed out philosophy that higher education itself or faculty and academic institutions need to perform a winnowing function. And that to me, and the whole the weed out culture is, this gets back to David Lody's work at the University of Texas at Austin, where Lottie realized he, through the way he approached courses with a weed out mentality, he himself made sure that at least 2,000 African American students who had been in his chemistry course could never go to medical school. And, he came to the realization, what if I actually focused on mastery of content? And students who mastered it could earn an A, and it didn't matter how many A's we gave, as long as, like, everyone can earn one if they master the content and meet the high expectations. And that wasn't only a shift in his philosophy, it was actually a shift in an institutional philosophy and approach to the work. So anyway, it's the history of grading really aligns really well with the history of a perception around what those courses exist for. And I think institutions have to answer for themselves. Do the courses exist to quote unquote winnow, or the courses exist to prepare students in ways that they can all thrive? Now, there will be a subset of students, no matter what an institution does, that will not succeed for many cases for reasons beyond what's going on within the institutional context, right? Life got in the way, things along those lines, right? So I'm not saying 100% of students will earn A's, but right now, a lot of the structures that are in place actually mean most of the students want to earn A's, even if they have the capacity to do it. Things like curve grading and the list goes on, right? So anyway, the point I get at, with the question around the history of grading, it does get back to the other element that you brought up, which was um, D.L. Stewart's um, work in her essay Twisted at the Roots, which really gets at from the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, uh, for whom was higher ed constructed? And it asks the question, and who's it serving now? And if the constructs don't match up with the structures from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, um, then we have to sort of reimagine things, reinvent things, transform things so that we meet the students we actually have, not some idyllic sense that really goes back to a wealthy landed gentry, right? I mean, like, so anyway, I, link those pieces, but rather than a separating function, really getting at an uplifting function. And again, raising expectations on students, but to do that, you have to raise expectations on institutions, right? And that's part of that chapter too. And then, failure to do that does perpetuate systemic inequity. It absolutely positively does. And I'm not just saying it because, I, um, it's something I read one day. I'm saying that because we have the data, we've looked at it, and we've looked at it in our work, we've looked at it in other forms of work, other forms of research. But we also know from that research that there are things in institution that faculty, staff, academic administrators have within their control that they can do to address that, right? So hence that chapter, right? If you want to move away, and there's a reason why I even use gateway course experience as opposed to weed out course experience, right? We were fortunate. My friend and colleague Brent Drake, who now works at the Gardner Institute as our one of our senior vice presidents, worked with me on a book along with Ambery Hunter, Elaine Seymour, talking about Leaving Revisited. And Elaine, Tim Weston, Brent and I worked on a chapter. And because in a previous book, they referred to it as the Weed Out Course chapter, they maintain that structure. And I really we talked about it, and I had some real challenges saying, you perpetuate that just by using that verbiage. So we even chose different verbiage to talk about the types of courses here to move away from conscious or subconscious approaches to saying, well, we have to have these to weed students out. So anyway, Katie, I belabored that, but I think I hit on all three of your questions. So
You did. Thank you. Um, Excellent. And so the next thing I want to ask you about is the Gateway course completion line. And in the book, you say failing even one foundation level course was correlated with leaving college, even if the student was doing well academically. Can you explain a little bit about how you came up with the name for the chapter? And can you talk a little bit about the tyranny of practice? And what
sure.
are these practices? And how do we move beyond them?
All right, so there's a lot there. And what I don't want to do is repeat an approach that a classmate of mine in the third grade introduced me to. And I thought they were very clever. At the same time, by the second or third time they did it, I realized they probably hadn't read the book. And that was when, although I know you have, right? And I'm serious. Katie got the only other copy of the book that I had about 3 weeks ago from the publisher, right? And then I thought, okay, that was nice that she asked for it. But then she started like emailing me over the span of a weekend, and I'm like, damn, she's really reading this thing. So, back to this. Um, to anyone who has studied sociology or is a sociologist or even is friends with a sociologist or clearly the Gateway course completion line is a nod to Du Bois's concept and construct of the color line. And that was quite intentional on my part. And in the chapter itself, I acknowledge that, like right up front, right? Because I don't want to take credit for something, but I'm building on that. And the reason why I chose that for the chapter title, and I wrestled with this, and actually I went back and forth with Betsy Barefoot on this a bit as she looked at some of the chapters as I wrote them. It wasn't because I was trying to be like cutesy or whatever, but because when you really delved into the data, it became abundantly clear that race and ethnicity were the best predictors of who did or didn't succeed in foundational level gateway courses. And when you brought that up, I wrote that up after the third time of being nudged, and it should happen after the first time by my colleagues at the American Historical Association. I wrote that up for Perspectives on History, the American Historical Association monthly publication. And, I pointed out whether it was in history or intro bio or intro chem or first college credit bearing algebra or first college credit bearing calc, race ethnicity was always the best predictor of who succeeded. Even more, although Pell status and first generation status were good predictors, but race ethnicity in particular were the best predictors. So the title itself is calling out that there was a latter 20th, early 21st century form of color line in these courses. If we didn't want that, right, then how would you do what David Laude did, was raise expectations, build in supports, do elements, recognizing that not all students came from the same, high-powered, well-resourced high schools, or maybe had been away from high school for decades, by the time they enroll. But how would you build a course where students can demonstrate mastery, can meet high expectations? But the first thing you have to do is acknowledge there's an issue, and that's why that title, and that's why that examination in looking at it and coming into it. Now, in terms of what one can do, I've alluded to this a bit already, but there are opportunities to utilize evidence-based, high impact pedagogies. There are opportunities to embed peer support if you have a scenario, or embed support period, where whether it's through technology or in class in a traditional sense environments. I remember reading an essay in the New York Times, or rather an opinion piece in the New York Times, where the faculty member writing it said, "What can you do if all your students work full time and can't go to the lab, because they're working full time, or the academic help lab?" Well, the answer is, if they're all working full time and that, build it into the course. Easy said. It takes work to do that. But again, these are all design elements that can be factored in. And the book gets into a number of those strategies. I will say that the book, by design, is a book to call attention to the issue. Share some strategies, but it's not an encyclopedia of pedagogy or structural change. The Gardner Institute has some publications that share those types of things, right? This wasn't that. This book really is a call to action with enough in it to say, hey, there are better ways. There's evidence showing there are better ways. But often academic administrators and a lot of faculty staff, that's not what we learned in graduate school, right? So even getting it within the book as sort of an introduction to those types of things would be helpful. And then, of course, the last chapter, which we'll talk about, I think we will. I think you told me you were going to ask about it, so I won't belabor it here. But does get into, all right, what's a broader approach or a broader system for, okay, now that I see there's an issue, we've collected data, we've dug into it, there's some will here, what do we do, right? So it isn't simply a call to action, it's a call to action with a model for action. And, to get to your point, it is about identifying, unsustainable and in many cases inequitable gaps in performance. And with the challenges that we have in terms of public perception of value and trust in higher ed, with elements associated with, in many cases, depending on the population that you look at least by age group, shrinking potential enrollments over the next 15 to 20 years. Look, if our job is to make sure students learn, then let's make sure students learn, and then we don't nearly have to worry about smaller enrollments because more students will thrive and be there. So anyway, but that is how that chapter came about, how it got its name, and what it's encouraging institutions to do. And I'm very aware, particularly as in 2022, 2023, as we were finding this, that in many states there's legislation that prohibits some of this type of work. at least looking at by race, ethnicity. But there are ways to get at it through zip code. There are ways to get at, and you'll find tight alignment, and this goes back to, well, it dates before, but it certainly was reinforced through New Deal era redlining efforts. I mean, there's a lot of correlation between zip code and race, ethnicity, and wealth in the United States, right? So, whether it's zip code, whether it's rural and urban compared to suburban, things along those lines, first gen. So there are ways to get at this that still comply with a lot of the um, mandates or laws that are in place in some states in the US right now. So you just gotta have to figure out your lens, right? And if it's not race, ethnicity, there are lenses to still do this work.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. So, as you alluded to, let's talk about action, taking action. In chapter 5, you talk about the three-phase process of addressing gateway courses. So, to begin with, can you talk about the model? What is it based on, and how have you tested it?
Sure, sure. And I think that it's kind for you to say you in this case, Katie, and I will also say the you means you'll see pretty quickly when you get into chapter 5, they use the Gardner Institute, right? Like I was fortunate um, to be maybe the main early designer on it, although I got by with a lot of help from friends at that point in time, so I wasn't the sole. I'm also fortunate that we have colleagues like Stephanie Foote now who are making it better, right? Um, but the model itself comes out of a course redesign approach that we began developing in 2013, and really rolled out in 2013-14. And we were compelled to design this at the Gardner Institute because for almost a decade prior, we had been collecting data from institutions on gateway courses, although at the time we called them your top 5 killer courses, right? And what we began to amass with doing that for over a decade was really disturbing. And it pushed us to saying we have to, now that we have this evidence, we need to go deeper, and we have to provide support to institutions to go deeper and do something with that evidence. But we devised and rolled out and at 13 institutions, inaugural institutions in a pilot cohort, and we're probably up coming close to about 100 institutions that we've worked with. And in some instances, they were, single institutions that said they were interested in this work. And, in one instance, we had 25 uh, colleges and universities out of the University System of Georgia work with us for 6 years on this, right? We had 9 institutions in Michigan, and at the time, Michigan, could definitely agree on one thing, and they agreed they weren't a system. But those 9 institutions, 2-year and 4-year, some private, mostly public though, they all came into the work because they recognized they shared in common the need to do this coursework. So we devised and improved that model, and it's really a 3-phase model. And if you never work with the Gardner Institute in course redesign, and by the way, I'd love to work with you all in course redesign and a broader institutional transformation effort. But if you never work with us, but you want to do this work, read chapter 5 and you'll have our model, right? I say this, the first phase of it really is gathering data and analyzing it and using a framework principles to sort of deconstruct that evidence, and to do that with, in many instances, course level committees. Sometimes at smaller institution, the course is one person named Stephen, and that's a lonely committee, right? So sometimes at smaller institutions, and by the way, if there's a Stephen here, I wasn't talking about you. But elements with all of this is that, developing an evidence-based community practice to begin to delve in and really understand the evidence in many ways, right? Survey evidence that we use using a student assessment of learning gains survey, which is about perceptions of learning, historic performance data in aggregate and disaggregated formats, and really letting faculty and staff, well-educated people, well-intentioned people begin to question that. What we found in the work is that a lot of folks never actually knew that about their own courses, right? And that wasn't their issue. It was that the institution had the data, but these fine folks didn't know where to get it. They didn't know how to apply it if they had it. So again, first phase, gathering evidence, analyzing evidence, and then building initial course redesign plan. The second phase of the work is implementing that course redesign and plan and monitoring what goes on. It's action-based research and action-based improvement. We factored in by design a third phase, and we had a national advisory committee of teaching and learning experts from across the United States. At the time, Uri Traceman and Elaine Seymour and Shirley Malcolm from AAAS. I mean, really super smart, super accomplished people. And what they had told us and what their research showed is that often very well-intended folks will try a redesign effort. It will be hard. It won't work out the way they had intended, and they'll go back to doing what they had done previously. And that's why we created the third phase, which, if the second phase is about, acting and monitoring, the third phase was about continue action and refining based on the experience, right? So those are the three broad phases. The chapter itself describes those, but it also describes all the various and sundry components in it. And if you wanted to build this and do this on your own, you could, just based on the blueprint that's in there, right? So anyway, that's a 5,000-foot view, maybe not 30,000, but 5,000-foot view of sort of what's in that chapter. But if you want to get to the ground level, it's in there, right?
So if there are individual faculty out there wondering how they as individuals can redesign their gateway course, perhaps they don't have the institutional support to redesign all sections, but they want to impact what happens in their classroom, what advice do you have for them?
First off, I think all faculty, particularly those, most faculty, and especially those who've been at this for a while, they are teaching and learning experts in their domain, right? Whether they're cognizant of that expertise or not, they've accrued some, especially over time. One of the challenges there is doing something different. I mean, it's hard to change, right? I like, and I personally favor doing this with peers because it's hard to change. And this notion of like doing it alone, that can get exhausting fast, right? What I recommend, that doesn't mean don't try it alone, but I would recommend working to find a friend, right? And it's not like go out and make a friend today, right? But working to find somebody, they may not even be a person teaching the same course you're teaching, right? It may be a researcher or someone else, but at least building a bit of a community around this to help you go farther than you would be able to do on your own. Again, I'm not dissuading individual action or effort. I just know that can get tiring and hard to sustain over time. So it's not don't do it alone. I mean, if you're really looking for some resources, I mean, there's an array of books we can reference and things along those lines. But the Gardner Institute is published there online at no cost except your time accessing them. PDF copies out there if you want the physical thing, but you can view it electronically. A bunch of anthologies about case studies and approaches folks have used. There are an array of networks, for those involved in faculty development. There's the pod network that's excellent. Scores of journals, elements associated with the scholarship of teaching and learning. But to get back to your point, for an individual, I would start with some of those broader elements, but I would also, if not coterminously, at least in a very intentional, closely dovetailed manner, begin to see if you can build a network that not only helps you, but you help them in this work. So maybe not the answer you were looking for, Katie, but it's rarely a insert tab A into slot B design sort of thing. And again, getting back to sort of a riff on an African proverb, if you want to go farther, go together, right?
Right.
So,
And it occurs to me as you were talking, though, another good place to start may be with your own internal IR department
oh,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
find out what data, there is
What's
that you
there?
haven't accessed on your course.
Yeah. And I'm, you know, I know this simply because I was never a director of institutional research, but some of my best friends were and or are. And so, and I'm shocked the amount of times I hear, well, we put them all out in the data dashboard. Why don't they know that? Right. So I think that, thank you, Katie, for leading the witness. But I think that's also a place to start for the evidence. And it's in work that we did with the American Historical Association and History Gateways Initiative. Um, and I don't think this is unique to either history faculty or faculty of humanities. Um, there was a gap that had to be bridged between IR offices and faculty in the academic units. So, but I'd also say if it's already available in dashboards and whatnot, most of the IR folks I know who do this work are thrilled that folks use them. So again, not saying you will have them, but you might be surprised what you have access to. You just need to ask. So thanks for that prompt.
Sure. So we'll now open it up to questions from the guests here today. So Mark Palmer has asked a few questions. So I'm going to try and sort of put them all together so we can so you can address them. So Mark
Mark's
asked,
not limited to one though.
no, no, no.
Oh, yeah, but
No, Mark, no, Mark, we appreciate your enthusiasm. So Mark says, how can we transform these courses such that they set students up to succeed with the assumptions that they are prepared and we need to change? Or how can we do this without, get them through quietly, simply looking at lower DFWI rates and fewer complaints?
um, so Mark, I'm gonna challenge you a bit on the assumptions that the students are prepared to succeed. And this may sound oxymoronic coming from me. Um, in my experience, both looking at the data and actually teaching, um, not all students had come from families with the same privilege and background, right? So, but it's been my long held view since 1992, 1993, when I started working with summer bridge programs, um, that even if there are gaps in preparation, um, there are opportunities and structures that we can use to mitigate those gaps and believe that all students can succeed and all students can learn, even if there are gaps. And I think if we, to be blunt, if we want to talk about equitable outcomes, there's nothing more inequitable than just passing students to say that you've lowered a DFW rate, right? So it really does come back to uh, taking a approach that goes towards mastery of content. And that does have high expectations for students, but meets them where they are. And that'll look differently for some students in the very same course. And that's why it takes time to do this work. That's why the first time, rarely, if ever, do you get it right. And then you need to layer and add components, but I do think it is innately or explicitly unjust just to say we've lowered DFWI rates if the students haven't actually mastered content. So it's the emphasis on mastery that I think is most important, and then meeting students where they are. because we know they come from different backgrounds and different opportunities prior to enrollment.
So that just leads us perfectly into Mark's next question. Aren't race and ethnicity highly correlated with socioeconomic status?
The short answer, yes. Um, but not always. So yeah, and um, I think there are elements associated with zip code, associated with rurality. You know, my work in Indiana for almost a decade and a half, there were a heck of a lot of students who received a Pell Grant or qualified for free and reduced lunch who came from counties that were 96, 97% white in rural regions in Indiana at the time. So I think it's a yes. And, you know, one of the uh, essays that we had in a newsletter I wrote for one of our newsletters, it didn't manifest itself in this book, but it gets back to Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? And, you know, King rightly pointed out that there were at that time 2 times as many poor white persons as there were poor African Americans or poor persons of color. It's just that proportionally, uh, persons of color were more likely to be poor. So I do think income is definitely something that needs to be considered and maybe one of those elements that can be considered in ways that crosses all race ethnicity groups and helps all learners learn. So anyway, it was a long-winded answer. The short answer is yes, but it's not necessarily a perfect correlation.
Right. Um, Mark's next question is, my biggest concern is math placement in STEM because colleges have lost touch with what's happening in high schools.
Yes, it is a concern of mine. I don't know that it's my biggest concern, Mark, but I have a lot of concerns, right? And that is one of them. I think in STEM in particular, the biggest element is calc readiness and the degree to which students then have access to other courses in the curriculum. We see this in work that's closely related to what we do in course redesign. It's our work with structural complexity in curricula. I will say that sort of a more traditional view, and I don't want to be pejorative, but I'll even say that a more arcane view is to say until you're calc ready, you can't do all these things. I'd recommend looking at Nathan Klingbeil's work, where he identified what content in courses, and this was particularly in engineering, required calculus. And he was able to do a bridge component for students. When I say a bridge component, not just a bridge, but a co-requisite component for students who were not calc ready, but so that they could start doing things like circuits and start doing engineering already in the first term, which they couldn't have done based on the structure because he learned, for instance, in this example, that there was one specific form of differential equation that students needed to know. So if you did a co-requisite piece and also did some elements in a bridge, they could go into circuits. What he discovered through doing that over a number of years, and this is again Nathan Klingbeil at Wright State, that the students who went through this structure and program that he created actually did as well, and in some years better than the students who came in calc ready. So I do think the maths readiness thing is important, but I also think sort of having that traditional view that you can't do anything until you've finished calc really inhibits possibilities. And as Klingbeil has shown, it's what type of learning and what type of context. You know, in physics and in other realms, there's called the just-in-time learning approach, and I think that applies here as well. So take a look at Nathan's work in particular. And I think you'll find him on YouTube. You'll find him on he's written about this, but it's a good example of what can be done with determining the math that's needed to thrive in a curriculum and really master content.
Excellent. Stephanie Foote just shared the TED Talk, Nathan Klingbau's TED Talk, and Dawn Archie says we have adapted the Wright State model to our university and our engineering students and have had a lot of success with it. So
See,
thanks for
Dawn and Kate and Stephanie say Drew's not totally making this up. Yes,
you.
thank
You
you,
have been
Stephanie.
co-signed.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So, and Mark's last comment is one of my favorite quotes from a university president is, "I want transformational change without controversy." And probably they want it quickly too.
Yes, yeah. And I'd like to drop 15 to 20 pounds without having to diet, right? And I'm saying this, that's actually a rather flippant response on my part. So shame on you, Drew. But I am not calling for everything to be controversial and everything to be contentious. But change is hard. And in some of my recent writing in our newsletter, and Katie's familiar with it because she's helped pare it down so people would actually read it. So thanks, Katie. I make the case that it takes, and with a nod to Leo Lambert, emeritus member of our board, emeritus president at Elon University, but it takes a decade to get hard things done. And I'm not saying it may take a decade to transform a gateway course, but I will say once you start working on it, it will take time. And just when you feel like you haven't mastered, your students will change, the circumstances around you will change. It's nice to think all will sing harmonious together, but there are creative tensions in the act of doing this work. I have heard from a president who says, I want to improve student learning and outcomes, but I don't want to involve the faculty. And my response with that is, well, then you're destined to fail, right? I mean, it's they didn't like my response, but it's an honest one. So I think we need to be really forthright that this will be hard, this will be messy, but few things that result in substance change and positive change are neat, tidy, and easy. Otherwise, they would have happened already. So that's not a jab at your president or a president, whoever you heard that from. But from my vantage point, there may be some controversy. There may be some argumentation. I think getting folks together in a room, working together, whether that's virtual, real, or a combination of the two, is the only way to go. Otherwise, it's transpiring anyway. They're just doing it away from one another. So definitely discourse is super significant and super important in this. And that's why our model in chapter 5 is about a task force getting together for a course and working across courses, because it gets people speaking about this, and then they're less likely to perhaps imagine a reality that doesn't exist. So change is hard. I realize that's a flippant response, but I don't know how you get transformational change without some tension from time to time.
Thank you. So Drew, and this is not an advertisement for the Gardner Institute, but just because people have asked. So if people want to delve deeper and get a little deeper into this work, I know you're offering a workshop in
Yeah,
March. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, and the Institute's offering a workshop, to be clear. I'm part of it, so Stephanie Foote, but so's actually probably about 7 other folks associated with the Gardner Institute. And it is very much so around this, right? The book. And in essence, it has 5 components that correlate directly with the 5 chapters. I'm fortunate that Dr. Stephanie Foote is helping lead this with us, and that we're making sure that it is, a little bit of hearing from the author, hearing from experts at the Institute, but a good chunk of it is about um, using the book and what's in the book and all other resources to either build on momentum already underway at your institutions or create momentum at your institutions to work on course redesign and then create a model and a process to do that. When I say create, repurpose ours, right? And I say all that. 2 days in Asheville. New York Times just did an article today on all the Asheville restaurants opening back up and that you know they're recovering from Helene. We'd welcome you to come to Asheville to do that, right? We've capped it, and you'll get a copy of the book. So if you haven't bought one yet, you'll get it by coming to this thing, right? And if you have bought one, um, we'll give you another one that you can give to a friend, right? So there you go. But yeah, no, we're structuring around the book, but it's about much more than just the book, and it's really helping people sort of make the case and build the case for doing this type of work back at their own institutions or in the systems in which they work.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. We have 8 minutes left. If people have any other questions, just put them in the Q&A. I have one last question for Drew. I don't know. I didn't tell him I was going to ask this, so we'll surprise him. So Drew, what are you reading now?
Um, so I didn't know you were going to ask that. I'm working on two books right now. One I'm trying to dig out, but one is from a sociology professor at Princeton um, that is about creativity and imagination. Um, and then the other, and this one is a short read. Actually, both are reasonably short reads, but they're wonderful juxtapositions. But one is from a Holocaust survivor titled "Happy Every Day," and it's sort of the first half of the book is about his experiences in various concentration camps and labor camps, but also what that taught him about life outlook, right? So, for those of you that are being like, oh, he must be, delving into, Kierkegaard. I've done that, but sometimes I like to read for passion, joy, and fun. And those are the two I'm working on right now. I do have a biography of Jim Thorpe. That's about 500 pages that I've started with, but I kind of put that on the side as I was kind of going through these two. So yes, Katie, I did not know you were going to ask that. Otherwise, I'd remember the author and the title of the book verbatim. But I'm glad you did that. It keeps it like fresh. Yeah.
You can bounce that question back to me if you want, because I have a good answer.
Katie, what are you reading?
Anybody who knows me knows I love to talk about what I'm reading. I just finished reading James by Percival Everett, which is a retelling of Huck Finn from the perspective of Jim.
Of
Real,
GM.
really, really good book. And it's so good that I listened to it, and I highly recommend listening to it. And then I read it.
Cool, cool. Yeah.
So highly, highly recommend. And of course, it's being nominated for all the awards. So it's not a secret find I found, but a
Now,
great.
is that because people are like, well, Katie's reading it? Time like give it an award.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like it being an Oprah book selection.
Yeah, I'm digging around in my bag just to show you the book cover, but I'm like, well, where did I put it? So anyway, I digress. But yeah, that's what I'm working on. And by the way, you've given me a suggestion that I will follow up on. As a American Studies type, part literature plus part philosophy, part history. So, and this sounds like a perfect uh,
Yeah, yeah. And
mixture.
I just ordered Huck Finn because I think it's been since I was in high school since I read Huck Finn. So now I want to put that context. Being a Missourian, it's right up my alley. But so we are at 4:55, and we thank everyone for being here. We're going to stick around for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, I'm going to turn off the recording, and you're welcome to stay and ask questions, or get ready and to have a few minutes between whatever is next for you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. Katie, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
This was um, it was really cool being on the other, quote unquote, other side of the table, right? So anyway,